Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. This is Khalil Ismail, and I am here with Sister Dalia Mogahed of ISPU. Grateful to have her on behalf of American Islamic Heritage Museum in honor of Women's History Month. And I'm following her work for a long time, actually, fan of her work. And go through her bio a little bit, just a little bit. It only tells a little bit of the story. And then, inshallah, we'll get to tell a little bit more. So Dalia Mogahed is Director of Research at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, where she leads the organization's pioneering research and thought leadership programs on American Muslims. Mogahed is former Executive Director of Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, where she led analysis of surveys of Muslim communities worldwide. With John Esposito, she co-authored the book, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. President Obama appointed Mogahed to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships in 2009. She was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations about U.S. engagement and Muslim communities. Her 2016 TED Talk was named one of the top TED Talks that year. She's a frequent expert commentator in global media outlets and international forums, and also the CEO of Mogahed Consulting. So, welcome.
Thank you.
How are you?
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
No problem. So, I want to jump right in, and this is this is just to kind of dive into basically the origin and the history of Muslims who are here, who have been here, who have traveled here. So I'm going to first start off with asking you about where you were actually born, if you were born here or not, and then if not, talk about your parents and how you got here.
Sure, thank you. I was born in Egypt, and my parents came to the United States not as immigrants, but as international students when I was 5 years old. And we moved to Madison, Wisconsin, where they started pursuing their graduate programs in engineering. So my parents they met when they were in college. My mom was the only woman in the School of Engineering at Cairo University of 10,000 students, believe it or not. She was the one and only woman in the aeronautical engineering program, which is, rocket science, I guess, rocket engineering. Right. And my dad and her met and eventually got married. And then they moved to the United States when I was 5, and my younger sister, Yasmin, was 1. And so we grew up in Madison, attending public school. It was just a huge change. I mean, I'm 5 years old, isn't that young? I remember the move. I remember how scary it was, how different everything was. I grew up in my grandmother's house in Egypt, where my grandfather was, Allah yarhamu, he's passed away. But he was a scholar of Islam. He was a professor at Al-Azhar University, actually in the women's school. And he was a professor of law and hadith studies. And he taught women students in Al-Azhar. Of course, Al-Azhar has been teaching women students for at least 100 years, and he was part of that. And so I really grew up under his influence and education. He really focused on teaching me about Islam and the Quran. And I just lived a very protected, sort of sheltered young life in the midst of adults, very focused, doting adults around me, because I was the first and only grandchild for a while until my sister Yasmin was born. And then was just like moved to the United States and was sort of thrown into a very different environment.
Okay, so you said 4 or 5 years old?
5 years old, kindergarten is when I started school, not knowing English.
So do you remember Do you remember do you remember that change?
I absolutely remember it very, very distinctly.
Yeah.
Just very, it's like going from a cocoon into sort of a war zone is how I felt. I mean, everything was so different. I didn't know the language. I was not even around that many children. I mean, I was just around adults, and I didn't go to daycare or anything, really, except I guess I did attend school in Egypt for 1 year. So I did have that experience, but it was just a different experience and very unfamiliar, and had to just very quickly learn a lot of things, learn the language, learn how to read. I was behind on reading, because of the language gap for a couple of years. But eventually, it all worked out. But I guess when I think back, making that kind of a move, I can't imagine doing that now as an adult. It was very scary for my parents as well, I'm sure, and they were overwhelmed in trying to figure out their own graduate program and so forth. And so we were just I felt like we were just all thrown in, into the deep end, and we had to figure it out.
So and there again, their primary motivation was school, was
education.
Education.
Yeah, and they had no intention of staying in the United States. So that's another thing. They were going to, especially my mom was on a scholarship where she would finish her graduate, finish her PhD and then go back to Egypt. And then, plans changed and we ended up staying, and here I am. So
okay.
I didn't get naturalized until I was well into my 20s. So I am a real immigrant right here.
So your father, so did your parents go back and forth a lot at first, or once they came, or what was their transition like?
They just couldn't really afford, the trip. It's quite expensive. We were all living on student, there were two foreign graduate students, not making a whole lot of money. We lived most of our childhood in student housing on very little money, got free lunch. I mean, I was poor. Because my parents were students for a very long time. Their program, I think they took 8 years to finish. So it was like my whole childhood. And we just didn't have a lot of money. So going back and forth wasn't much of an option. I think we went once during that time, and then at the very end. But I didn't have a lot of interaction or like firsthand experiences in Egypt after I left, really, because of that.
Okay. And were there others who related to you in your space, or I know you got kind of alluded to the fact that you didn't have that, but I just want to be sure. So there weren't others who traveled and went to the same area. Was there any community that you could be familiar with?
So I grew up, in the Madison Muslim community, which at the time I was growing up wasn't very big. There were a few other families, and they came together. They built a mosque on campus, still there. My dad was heavily involved in the masjid. They started a Sunday school, but it was very preliminary. It was a new community of mostly international students, and this was in the very early 80s. And and the number of kids that were Muslim and went to my school that I knew were pretty limited. There were a lot of international students. So I didn't go to a school where I felt alienated for being, from another country, because it was an elementary school that all of the international students' kids went to. And so it was very common that everybody was from a different country. And it was really celebrated. This way back in like 80s and early 90s. But we had a tradition of something called International Day, where everybody, dressed in their home countries, clothing and shared food from that country. I remember in my first grade class, only 2 kids had parents who were born in the United States. So I never felt different until I was in middle school. I thought it was just very common and normal that everyone was from all over the world, and that wasn't a big deal. Where it was harder, or where people did differentiate, wasn't around country of origin or even skin tone or skin color, but class, money. Poor kids and rich kids were at the same school because it also was the school of all the professors. It was like where all the professors and students' kids went, and we had radically different incomes.
Right.
And so if you got, if you had hot lunch, if you got free lunch, then that was something that people made fun of you for. And so the bullying of like not having the right brands, that you weren't wearing the Spree and the Gap and whatever. So that was where the bullying came from. And also I was overweight. So I got bullied for being fat, not having the right clothes, but never for my national origin or my religion. So it was interesting. I just had a different experience growing up.
Yeah, that is interesting. Do you find, and I'll look back to the youth a little bit, but before that, did you find that other people who were children of students had a similar experience to you, or you find yourself having a unique experience?
No, I think we were kind of in the same boat, but all alone. Like, it was funny. We didn't like, there was no solidarity around it. It was just, we were all kind of trying to be the, friends with the cool kids on our own, without realizing that we're all kind of in the same boat. But yeah, a lot of us had the same experience.
Okay. All right. And so Wisconsin was the main area. That was until you were grown, correct?
Until I graduated from college.
Until you graduated from college.
Yeah, okay. I went to the University of Wisconsin like my parents, and I didn't leave Wisconsin until I was graduated from undergrad.
Okay. So did you feel any deeper connection to your origin, like Egypt, or was there a way that you stay connected to that hometown? As a way your parents kind of provided a space for that, environment for that? And were there other people around also? Let me know.
Yeah, I mean, my parents had, a group of Egyptian friends, and we would meet, all the time and do things with a few other families. So there was a community of Egyptians around us that, that kept that alive. And I spoke Arabic at home exclusively until 3rd grade. And I still remember switching to English, and I don't know why. I don't actually remember why I did it, but I wish I hadn't. I wish my parents had said, speak Arabic, because my Arabic isn't as good as it should be because of that. But I used to speaking, Arabic, but my parents would always speak to me in Arabic. So whether I would respond in English. So I have perfect comprehension of Arabic, alhamdulillah, and I'm working, always growing my vocabulary. But I had that connection with being Egyptian because it was the food we ate. It was, the music my dad loved. It was the Quranic recitation that he would play in the car, Abdul Basit. So my heritage, in terms of my cultural heritage, was always present. And religion was something that provided the ethical framework in which I was raised, and definitely the boundaries, the moral boundaries that I was given. And we were very, our upbringing was strict. I think by standards of sort of common American or even Muslim American standards, it was a strict upbringing. We had to be home before dark. We couldn't have sleepovers. Obviously, we couldn't date. That was like completely out of the question. I was like,
right.
Under no circumstance. We and then we had to bring home straight A's, or there was help to pay. So the kind of standard upbringing, I guess, for a lot of children, especially children of immigrants. So it was something that I felt like I inherited. Religion was something, although I was very spiritual as a very young child, believe it or not, under, living with my grandfather, I moved, or I sort of drifted away from that, just going to public school and having almost no Muslim friends, trying to fit in. And so religion was something that I always believed in. It's not like I ever doubted God or anything. I just it wasn't like it wasn't like my central identity growing up and so like this pivotal moment is, as I was growing up, and especially in middle school and high school, I became much more interested in social justice. And I started reading about the civil rights movement. It was something that it just resonated with my soul. Like it was something that I felt a great deal of, it felt very relevant to me and to my experience. Like one time I was talking to someone, this white boy, and I don't remember what the context of the conversation was. And he goes, "Dalia, you're not white." And I didn't say I was white. I didn't think I was. But I guess I never thought of what I never had ever sort of the idea, the color. I was in middle school and I'm like, I'm Egyptian, I'm Muslim. Like I didn't think in terms of color.
Right.
I thought in terms of like culture and background, because that's how it wasn't in elementary school. Like, you're from Senegal, you're from Nigeria, you're from Egypt, you're from Korea. Like that's how we thought. We didn't think in terms of you're Black, you're white, you're Asian. So anyways, so he said that to me and I was like, So I thought we were like friends, and I didn't think he was thinking of me as like other. I just didn't get it. And not that I thought I was like him in terms of color, but I just realized, no, I'm not like him, and he wants me to know that.
Right.
So that was kind of an awakening of sorts that day in middle school. I was like, oh, okay, not white. Good to know. And that's how things work here. So
Right.
I felt a tug in my heart for understanding sort of like race in America and the history of racism and how people fought back. And it was a part of the Islamic tradition that I felt was just like very clear around racism being haram, like that's how I just thought of things. And that's how I was educated, whether it's, reality on the ground or not. That is what I knew was right and normative. So anyways, so I was kind of reading about that history and civil rights, and we were starting to learn about it in school when I was 15. And then I stumbled on this book in the library that, to my like shock and awe, was about a Muslim civil rights leader, which I was like, what? I thought my family was the first Muslims in America, which obviously is totally wrong. But in my little context, that's how it felt, right? I didn't know anyone else. No one else was there before us. We were the founders of the masjid. It was just like, I don't, how do I know? So I was like, oh my God. There were Muslims in America in the 60s and And so, checked the book out, read it in just like a span of a few days. And of course, it was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And it was like, complete mind blown. Everything changed. Like my whole life changed when that happened. Everything changed. Because it's like, it seems so like, how did you not know that? Like, how was I going to know? My parents had no idea. There was no one older than me to tell me. We never went to a conference where someone would tell me. We had no real interaction with a national Muslim American community at all. It was just like whoever was in Madison, our little mosque, my public school, and that's it. So this was like my window into this world of like, oh my God, there's been Muslims in America since before Columbus, this is like a very long history, and that my faith played a role in this movement that I was so passionate about. And I was like, and I tell the story, like that was the day that I went from being a Muslim in America to feeling like an American Muslim. And I wasn't American yet, but I felt like a certain kind of ownership or belonging that I hadn't had before. And it was through the African American experience. And that's why I always talk about the debt, and I almost can't talk about that crying, the debt we have as immigrants, truly, to the giants that came before us and are with us now, of course, but the debt we have to the struggle of Black Muslims and Black people overall in the United States, who, without that, we would not have a claim. We would have no belonging here. We would be foreign forever. Why are fourth generation French Muslims called fourth generation French-born Algerians? Why are they called that? Because they can never find a real claim to belonging. And the only reason I can say, I am an immigrant. No, I'm not, any my kids are not. Let's talk about my kids. They were born, American-born Egyptians. They're just American. They're just American, period, right? They're Muslim American. That's a thing. That's real, because Islam's been a part of the U.S., the American story, since its inception and before. But who carried that legacy? It's not like it was just some generic Muslim. Like, it was Black Muslims. That's who did it. So when we're able, all of us collectively as Muslims, able to say those things, we have a debt to pay. We have a certain homage we need to have, at least in our hearts, for how that happened, right? It's not random.
Right.
Add to that the Civil Rights Act, which allowed immigration from places that many South Asian and Arabs come from that wasn't there before. And how did that act happen? How did that come to be? So there's just a lot of, and whether it's policies or laws or immigration or just the narrative, we can, and I say this because I compare it to Muslims in Europe. There is no civil rights movement to hearken to in France or in the UK or in Germany. They don't have it in their history to say, this happened, and so we have something to call on to demand our equality. In fact, I think it's so interesting that even Muslims in Europe, Germans and British and French Muslims, will actually talk about our civil rights movement, like the one like they have to borrow from us, right?
True.
And so, look at the global Western Muslim debt to the struggle of Black people in America. And I think all of this is really important. And so I think I sort of, my political and social sort of awakening, if I, whatever there is of it, happened or began with that book. And it was also a spiritual awakening. And so many people, so many people say that they, who converted to Islam, came to Islam, embraced Islam as teenagers, it's usually after reading the autobiography. I mean, it's like such a common story, right?
Yeah.
The autobiography of Malcolm X, may Allah give him the highest firdaus with Habib. His legacy and what he's done, subhanAllah. I mean, such a short life, 39 years old, and he's done more than so many of us, right? And combined in our lifetime. Right. But it was a spiritual awakening in that it was no longer an inherited kind of like in the background religion anymore when I read that book. So it was like a conversion of sorts, because I started reading the Quran for myself again, and really looking in it for my answers around justice, around this theme of justice and human liberation. So there are all these theories that are being thrown around in a place like Madison. It's a very, very left-leaning progressive place. Okay. So, just to give you a picture, gay pride parades were very common in the 80s, like before, and it was very natural and common for someone to say they were gay, like in the 80s,
right,
in like middle school. Okay. So I'm just explaining, like, we were.
So you lived in the future.
30 years in the future, exactly. So it was just a very, so just a lot of like, I'm a Marxist, I'm a communist. Like people were just very, they were very political, and it was like some of the large, it's called the Berkeley of the Midwest, just a lot of like anti-war protests, and it's a very, very sort of active progressive movement type place, and a college town and so forth. So if you're a kid and you care about these kinds of questions of human equality and liberation, and I was really concerned, I was really passionately concerned as a teenager with this idea of human liberation, and what that meant. And so in the search for that, there were a lot of ideas that were swirling around in this milieu, in this climate, like feminism, or like socialism, whatever, all of these sort of isms that claimed to or promised this idea of human liberation. Oh, the one other thing I did, I just wanted to mention that was very formative, which I actually did before reading Malcolm X, is I did my 9th grade project on the history of the Ku Klux Klan. So it was like, pick something to do. It was American history class, and pick something to do your project on. And I picked the history of the Ku Klux Klan. Somehow everyone did more.
This is after reading the. When did you
read
read the
before.
book? Before the book, right? Okay.
It was like I said, I was passionate about racial equality.
Right.
So I felt like this was an important thing for me to learn about the history of this problematic, this movement, the Ku Klux Klan. And anyway, so this was so long ago, but my thesis for this paper, I swear to God, was the Ku Klux Klan was not an aberration. It was not some like fringe group that you can just dismiss as like,
Correct.
It was it's inherent to the American ethos. That was my thesis. And I was like, and I went on to prove why it was like so integrated into every aspect of American political and social life.
Yeah.
It was an extension of the American, narrative and vision of itself. Like, you cannot pretend that this is just this group that doesn't represent us. Like, no, it was like, and when you read about how far and deep it went, there's no way to say that it wasn't a part of the body. It wasn't some little foreign element that you can just, cut out and, oh, it's fine now. So anyways, that was my thesis. And my professor, who was a Republican, very openly a white Catholic Republican, gave me an A+. He really thought I did a good job of proving it in my research. And I poured myself into that paper. It was like 30 pages long. It was a real thing. I like read and read and read about it. So that kind of formulated, I was already disabused of sort of this myth of what America was about. And so when I read Malcolm X, it was like the missing kind of other side when his father was killed by the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it was just, so anyways.
It's like all the things came together. It came, it's like, and how old were you again at this point when you read that?
I had did the paper in 9th grade. So it was right before I read the book.
Right before.
I was 15. Yeah, 15 years.
Yeah.
And so I started reading the Quran from this perspective of wanting to look, where do we solve this? If America's supposed to be this solution to it is human equality, or it is human liberation, that's what it promises, is this secular democracy. Okay, here's this experiment, and that's what it's all about. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator to certain unalienable rights, right? So it's promising this thing, but its reality is like the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
Then what's the solution to that if it's not like this promise that America claims? So I was looking for that in the Quran. That is how I was reading it, through that prism. And I really did wrestle with the Quran. It's not like an easy read. You can't just read this book and breeze through it and think not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all.
It'll challenge you. Definitely
challenges me.
So speaking of that, I wanted to, because one of the things that hit me about that, and then we'll move on, is the from the Quran, America reminds me of the verses about the people who use their oaths as a shield.
Uses what? Say that again.
Who use their oaths as a shield, basically.
Oh.
There's an original sin here that has not been rectified, right? But the oath that is the opposite of that original sin tricks people into thinking that it's not that, right? So
Look over there. Look over there. Yeah.
And that's why the worst things can happen at the same time. We're at the same time, having really, really good things happen at the same time. This is the dichotomy of this place. There's so many, so much good. And at the same time, how could that same place have so much evil at the same time? And this is the thing that we're reconciling with. But Allah, the Quran, there's nothing like the Quran that breaks this down, this whole situation down. But that's a different conversation we'll have a discussion about that. Actually, I don't know how much time we actually have. We're almost, moving pretty fast. So I want to go into, because I did want to get back to how your spirituality, so you did talk about that a lot, so we can cover that, because I did want to go into how your spirituality actually informs your work. But before that, I did also, one of the reasons for having, doing this and doing more is in the idea, in the concept that we have to know each other better, and we have to know each other more specifically and in a more nuanced way, as Allah said, because there's so many, like you just wrote off an experience that if you hadn't said it, most people wouldn't guess it. You know what I mean? So people have their ideas of, people who come from a place and, what happens. And we all learn. What I've learned is that we all learn at the stage and at the time that Allah sees fit, right? And it's up for us to take that opportunity. But the question I have is before I get into the stuff that you ended up doing here and how it informed that, how much I want to know a little bit more about how much you reconciled being from Egypt Egypt being a place that obviously, Black people claim in a certain way, right? And then, there's the Arab, and then so is it Arab? Is it Black? How do you, is there a wrestling that goes on there? Is there a conflict there? Egypt is a very special place for a lot of people. So how do you frame this?
Well, Egypt is a very special place, period, for humanity.
Right.
And I don't see here's how I think about it. So I may look to people like my skin color doesn't look Black, probably to most people, in terms of how we define it in the United States. But
right.
if you look at folks like, my teacher, Imam Majid, who's from Sudan, he's Black, he's also Arab. Arab and Black are not in the same category. One's a linguistic, designation, and one is a color of the skin or race. So, just like there are Black Latinos, one's a language, one's a racial group. It's being Arab and being Black are not two mutually exclusive things at all. So, Egypt is a very diverse place, and if you've been there, you'll know that there are Black Egyptians, there are Egyptians that look totally white, and it has been invaded by everyone. It's the crown jewel of the ancient world, and so everybody was in there. The thing is, the Arabs as a race, or as an ethnic group, simply didn't have the demographic power, just in terms of numbers. The Egyptians were way more than them, way more than them. So to say that Egypt is ethnically Arab in terms of, from the Arabian Peninsula, I just don't see how that can be historically correct. Now they conquered, Amr ibn al-As conquered Egypt, and then about 500 years later, Egypt became majority Muslim. I mean, most people don't know that Egypt stayed majority Christian for centuries, until actually the Crusades. And it was the Crusades and their treatment of, people from the Middle East who were Christian, and their slaughter of them, that made a lot of people change their mind and convert to Islam. So that history, I think, is important. Who do I don't feel like this, I don't feel like this conflict in my heart, because I've always identified as African my whole life. Like, this isn't a new thing. This isn't something I decided to do last year or whatever. I've always said I'm African, and I'm also Arab, and I'm Egyptian, because Egypt's in Africa. And why are we learning about Egypt and the history of Western civilization? Like, when did we become Western? What? We're Western when we're producing amazing things, and then it's like, oh, now you're the third world. It's like, when did we morph from being your history? Like, when we study Western civilization, we start with Mesopotamia, then we go to Egypt, and suddenly, like, we're in Greece and Rome, and then Europe.
Right.
But then at some point, Egypt migrates into a totally different part of, continent. It's very strange.
Right.
So anyways, I don't have this internal conflict. I will be honest and say that when folks seem to be implying that I can't claim my own country of birth, I'm like, nah, this is my country. Like, my family has been there literally for thousands of years. You can't tell me that I'm kind of a foreign entity to my own homeland. Like, this is the motherland for me. And I have, we have documents that trace our family back thousands of years in this country. So no, I'm not gonna allow anyone to take my country away from me. But that doesn't mean Egyptians were, the color of Egyptians, they definitely weren't white. They were people of color. And I think there was a range. I think they were Black. I think they were brown.
Yeah.
That's what they look like in the depictions of them on walls and so forth. That doesn't mean I can't claim my country, though. That's
so it is so I sense a fight there, though. There had to be a fight. Was you've had, it seems like you've had to fight for that.
Yeah, it's weird because, you know, like in high school, I helped start an organization called African American Awareness, AAA or AAA.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did as an organization is put programs together to educate the student body about African American contributions. So like there would be like poetry readings or talks about different leaders or whatever. I mean, we would just put on these different programs. And I was the only one in this organization. I was like one of the founders, the organizers, who wasn't Black. And there were people who were like, felt some kind of way about me being there, being a part of it. And I definitely I wasn't claiming to be Black. I just felt, I guess at the time, I felt like, well, I'm African and this is African American Awareness. We're all in America. So I'm like, I belong here. Where, you know, people were like, you didn't have a middle passage experience, so you don't belong here. So anyway, that was kind of the first time I was like, oh, okay, I don't belong here. I'm not white. You know, I got to figure out where I do belong.
Right.
And so as a part of that experience, there was this, you know, this sort of awakening and discovery of Egypt as part of the heritage of African Americans.
Right.
But then there was this kind of tension then, what do you do with me? Who's like, we're excluding you, you don't belong, but yet we're gonna claim Egypt. And so it's like, well, I'm not asking you to include me, but you also can't take Egypt away from me. So you can claim Egypt. I have no problem with that. I never tell people, you can't, you know, this whole idea of getting mad at people for saying like Egyptians were Black or whatever. I never argue with that. I'm like, yeah, they were Black, they were brown, you know, maybe a few of them look like me. I don't know. But I'm not ever going to say that they weren't Black.
Sure. Yeah.
At the same time,
but you can't take it from you, though.
It's very like hard lines around things. Like either they were Black or they weren't Black. And then if they were Black, then everyone who isn't Black from Egypt is like a foreign entity. It's like, no, all these things can be true at once, you know?
Correct. That's what I wanted to know, because you know, in my travels, one thing that I find, and it is my absolute belief that if we are to actually solve this thing, is that we also have to support everyone else's love of themselves. You know, it's no way that this is going to work together if I don't want you to love yourself, but you got to love me, right? It's not going to work that way. You won't even be any good to me that way, right? You know what I'm saying? This is what so it's important that we protect not only, you know, our own selves and our own lineages and that, but also protect other people's right to what they have. And that's why I ask those questions, because I've done a lot of, in my own travels, I have seen a lot of where that's a fight for people who have come here, especially first kind of in kind of being like the first generation of being here, because we have this fight, and it's like kind of being in the middle of a fight, right? And I grew up, you know, Muslim too. And I grew up mostly with, you know, what you would call immigrants. They were mostly, it was Desi and some Arab and even Persian. I grew up with some, you know, with the people who were Shia. And one of the things that I recognize and I learned very quickly is that there is a level of, you know, lack of confidence with respect to that aspect, the aspect of being back. What am I? Because I'm not white, right? I know I'm not white. I'm not accepted here. And then there's the struggle of Blacks, and I don't want to offend them because they have had the struggle and it's real and it needs to be recognized. So where do I fit in, right? And it's important that we recognize that, that we have to recognize that everybody has that fight. It's the only way we're gonna survive this. So I wanted to ask you, one, you're kind of like, I guess what we would call, you have a lot of interests. Like, you did chemical engineering, and then you're like a marketer, and then you're like political activist. So talk about what, because obviously even to do all of that, there's a level of confidence in yourself and a level of freedom that you kind of have to be able to kind of move in these spaces. Talk about like how that formed, how you ended up, feeling the friend, and I'm conscious of your time. I know we only have,
Yeah.
a small amount of time. So talk about that, and then we'll move from there if you can briefly.
Yeah. So, as I said, I'm Egyptian, therefore I'm an engineer. So it's a little joke there.
Right. Right.
So my parents are engineers, and it's not like I was forced into it. My sisters didn't go into anything like that, but I did want. I wanted to go into a field that I would be able to work after graduation to support myself, and that was really important to me. That was like, I wanted to be independent. I didn't want to live at home for the rest of my life or until I got married. I wanted to just be able to go out and have an independent professional life. And that meant, a degree where I could work right out of school and be able to support myself. And engineering was something I knew. My parents were, I was good at math, whatever. So I was like, okay, I'll just do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't, it was around, it was kind of like, also I had this other idea that, this was a way to help the developing world, is like to develop different ways where they could be more independent and not depend on Western aid and Western control. And I felt like that the route to that was learning these kind of like technical fields.
Mm-hmm.
So I went into engineering, and at the same time, I was also writing for my college newspaper about Islamophobia, although there was no word for it at the time, and the Palestinian struggle, but mostly Islamophobia and issues around stereotyping Muslims. So I was doing that. And I was also the president of the Bosnia Relief Committee, which was an organization that helped survivors of the genocide in Bosnia and advocated for a lifting of the arms embargo. And then I also did, I was also a founder of a group called Truth in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
So I did all this advocacy and writing in the field that much closer to where I am now, but my academic work was in chemical engineering. So I had this like totally different worlds, and graduated and got a job in corporate America, got married, had my first son, and then, left activism. I was just, a corporate cog and a mom. So that was enough for me. And everything kind of got quiet until, September 11th, 2001. Like this horrific event changed everything. And I went back into wanting to be much more of an outspoken activist about our faith and our identity and so forth. And I was starting business school at the time. And so what I did is I changed my niyyah around why I was doing business school. It was initially because I wanted to do, certain kinds of more creative work within the corporate sphere, around consumer product design and things like that, and market research. And so I just kind of changed that to, I want to learn the same skills, but in the service of teaching people about Islam,
Mm.
helping people understand this faith rather than demonize it. And so I went into marketing and strategy with that in mind, with that as the goal and the niyyah behind it. And
Right.
so, alhamdulillah. And then, alhamdulillah. And then when I graduated, so during my time as a student, as an MBA student, I was also the outreach director for the Islamic Center of Pittsburgh. So I was like doing presentations and media interviews. It was my first experience with media, like local media and so forth, on behalf of the masjid and the Muslim community in Pittsburgh. And I was doing presentations like 3 or 4 times a week at different schools and churches and universities about Islam. So I was really developing the way to talk about our faith. And my goal was always to be understood, not to be liked. So I was never about, let me make you hate me less, or let me make you accept me, or think I'm good, or think I'm acceptable, or that I'm benign. I always wanted folks to understand us accurately. And so that was kind of how the switch happened. That was the turning point. And then
what made that? Because I will say, that was a reputation that a lot of people who came here did have, is that, it seemed to be apologetic in nature. And I have followed your work, and one of the things I've always been impressed with is the fact that you've always spoke the truth as you saw it. Right. But why? Like, why when, amongst a crowd of people, to be quite honest, and I have to be honest, it has been the language has been apologetic. Why? What made you different? What made you think differently? What influenced that?
I think it's informed. I mean, it's informed by that foundation I shared with you around. I didn't believe in the American myth. I knew what the Ku Klux Klan was, and it's just like one example. But I knew that this wasn't a hierarchy that I wanted to climb or join or be accepted into. I had been already disabused from that, and I'd already heard, once you hear Malcolm's voice in your head, you can't unhear it. And he comes at everything with so much izzah, his izzah is so powerful, his sense of like the truth above all. And then so that was like kind of my formative sources, but then studying the Sira in a great deal of detail was kind of really what deepened it. And what I heard in the Sira over and over is, no matter what, I mean, the Prophet ﷺ was being pelted with stones, and he would never compromise the message. And then but at the same time, he was asked, shh, Allah, the angels of the mountains will crush these people. Who and his wounds were bleeding and throbbing when he was asked this question. It wasn't like he had time to reflect and think. He was in the heat of it. And he said no. So this balance of, I don't want to destroy you. I have compassion for you, but you are not my Lord. I am not here to please you. I'm not here to serve you or win your pleasure. There's a higher power that I'm doing that for. So I remember, like, when I would go to really hostile audiences, and I knew they were going to be hostile, and I knew that they were really going to want, I'm going to feel this urge to want to appease them. I'm just going to feel like, okay, can I just say something that'll be a little bit easier on their ears? I would hear on the way to I would listen on the way to the event in the car to Surah Al-Shu'ara, where Musa alayhi salam is speaking to Pharaoh. And he's not compromising on anything. And he's being like, like beaten up rhetorically, or like he's getting all these arrows at him. And it would just fill me with a sense of courage.
Right. Right.
When I had to stand up and just tell them the truth, like I saw it,
Right.
you know, even
Right.
things that they would ask that they knew would be hard, you know, to answer in a politically correct way. And they would do it on purpose. And I would just be like,
Yeah.
here it is. Here's what we believe.
Right. SubhanAllah. Okay, to it.
Yeah.
About how you made Ramadan in 1-2 minutes. Ramadan, like how was your Ramadans? What made them special? Were they, what did your parents do? Like, what was,
Yeah.
how has it impacted you? Ramadan. That's it.
You know, Ramadan has always been, since I was an adult, not as a child so much. Ramadan was always something I just kind of had to survive as a teenager. It was hard. I had to still go to gym and play sports and sit with people in the lunchroom while they ate in front of me. So Ramadan's rough for kids who go to public school, just so everyone knows. But as an adult, I remember my first Ramadan alone, like after I moved out, when I was, working at Procter & Gamble, my first Ramadan kind of away from my family. And it was an incredibly transformative month for me, because it was something where I had to do everything very mindfully and very deliberately. No one was going to do it for me. No one was going to sort of carry the month for me or do anything or play out the traditions for me. I had to do it all on my own. And ever since that Ramadan, I have looked forward to Ramadans as a time of reassessing, a lot of introspection, and a lot of transformation. It really is it's like a time of like sped up change. That's how I experience Ramadan and why I look forward to it.
Thank you. Okay, this is Khalil Ismail with Dalia Mogahed. We will do a part 2, inshallah. When we do part 2, whenever we decide to do it, we're going to talk about the book you wrote with John Esposito. We're going to talk more about your activism, the height of it, the challenges of it, where you are now as to where you were before. And so I look forward to those things. But thank you really for a good grounding, a grounded foundational interview. And inshallah, we'll get back when we can for America's Islamic Heritage Museum.